I will never forget the moment my parents announced at my sister Amanda's rehearsal dinner that they were giving her their house as a wedding gift. Everyone erupted in applause, while I sat there in stunned silence, because for the past 5 years, I had been secretly paying their mortgage. Every single monthly payment of $2,000 came from my account after Dad's construction business went under. As the room celebrated this generous gesture, I realized the devastating truth. I had essentially bought my sister a house, and nobody knew it but me. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 5 years ago, my life changed forever when my father Robert called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, sobbing into the phone. His construction company had just collapsed after his business partner disappeared with all their equipment and most of their cash. Dad had guaranteed the business loans personally, which meant the bank was coming for everything, including the family home where my sister Amanda and I had grown up. I was 32 then, working as a senior software engineer at a promising tech startup in Cleveland. I had finally started making real money after years of climbing the corporate ladder, and I was planning to buy my first house. But when I drove over to my parents' place that night and saw my father sitting at the kitchen table with foreclosure papers spread out in front of him, I knew my plans had to change. Dad looked broken in a way I had never seen before. This was the man who had taught me how to throw a baseball, who had worked double shifts to pay for my college education, who had always been the rock our family depended on. Now he was staring at documents that would strip away everything he had built over 30 years of marriage. Mom sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she tried to calculate how much time they had before losing the house. They owed $180,000 on the mortgage, with monthly payments of $2,000 that included property taxes and insurance. On Dad's new retail salary at Home Depot and Mom's part-time receptionist job at a dental office, they could barely cover their basic living expenses. That night, I made a decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I told them I would take over the mortgage payments until they got back on their feet. Dad protested, saying he could not accept that kind of help from his son, but I insisted. What I did not tell them was that I had my lawyer draw up a formal agreement acknowledging my financial investment in the property. Dad signed it reluctantly, saying he wanted everything legally documented in case something happened to him. The sacrifices started immediately. Instead of buying my own home, I stayed in my modest one-bedroom apartment across town. I drove my 10-year-old Honda Civic until the transmission started slipping, then bought another used car instead of the truck I had been saving for. I canceled my gym membership, stopped eating out, and learned to love discount groceries from the store 2 towns over. Every month, like clockwork, I transferred $2,000 from my checking account to my parents' mortgage account. I never missed a payment, never complained, never asked for anything in return. I told myself this was temporary, that Dad would find better work and eventually take over the payments again. But months turned into years, and the temporary arrangement became my new reality. Meanwhile, my sister Amanda continued living her charmed life in downtown Cleveland. She worked part-time as a yoga instructor, which barely covered her car payment, but somehow she always had money for designer clothes, weekend spa trips, and dinners at expensive restaurants. She had been married twice before, both times to men who seemed more interested in funding her lifestyle than building a real relationship with her. Amanda never questioned how our parents managed to keep their house and maintain their standard of living on their reduced income. She visited every Sunday for dinner, accepted their generosity when they helped pay for her various ventures, and never seemed to notice the strain on their finances. As far as she knew, everything was fine. But I knew the truth. Every time I drove past their house and saw the well-maintained lawn and fresh paint, I knew I was looking at my investment. Every time Amanda posted pictures on social media from her latest vacation or shopping spree, I calculated how many mortgage payments that money could have covered. The resentment grew slowly at first, then faster as I watched her live without consequences, while I carried the weight of our family's financial survival. The breaking point should have come years earlier, but I loved my parents too much to put conditions on my help. I wanted them to keep their dignity, to feel like they still had something to offer their children. I never imagined they would take my secret sacrifice and turn it into ammunition for the ultimate betrayal. That betrayal was sitting in front of me now, disguised as a wedding gift, while everyone in this expensive restaurant celebrated my parents' generosity with money that I had been quietly providing for 5 years. The legal documentation tucked away in my home office suddenly felt like the only protection I had against my family's selective memory about who had really saved their house. The rehearsal dinner was being held at Palazzo Grande, one of Cleveland's most exclusive Italian restaurants, courtesy of Tyler's family. Tyler was Amanda's latest fiancé, an investment banker whose parents owned half the waterfront property in the city. As I sat in my only good suit, a navy blue Jose Bank special I had bought 3 years ago, I watched Tyler's mother discuss their upcoming trip to their villa in Tuscany, while wearing earrings that probably cost more than my annual car insurance. Amanda glowed at the head table in a champagne-colored designer dress that I recognized from her Instagram posts last month. She had tagged the boutique where she bought it, and, out of morbid curiosity, I had looked up the price. $800 for a dress she would wear once. $800 that could have covered almost half a mortgage payment. The wine was flowing freely, bottles of Chianti that cost more per glass than I usually spent on an entire dinner. Tyler's father was regaling everyone with stories about his latest acquisition, a commercial real estate deal that would net his firm several $1,000,000. The conversation swirled around investments, market trends, and vacation properties, while I sat there calculating how many mortgage payments I could have skipped if I had kept just 1 month's worth of this family's casual spending money. Then my father stood up, his wine glass shaking slightly in his hand. Robert looked older than his 62 years, his hair completely gray now, and his face lined with the stress of the past 5 years. He was wearing his best shirt and tie, the same outfit he wore to church every Sunday and had worn to both of Amanda's previous weddings. "I want to say something to my beautiful daughter and her soon-to-be husband." He began, his voice cracking with emotion. "Janet and I have been married for 36 years, and we have learned that the most important thing you can give your children is security and love." The room quieted as Dad paused to collect himself. I could see tears forming in his eyes, and I felt my stomach tighten with dread. I knew my father well enough to recognize when he was building up to something big. "Tyler, you are getting a wonderful woman who deserves the very best life has to offer. And Amanda, sweetheart, your mother and I want to make sure you have that security we always dreamed of giving you." He raised his glass higher. "So, we have decided to give you our family home as our wedding gift to you both." The room exploded in applause and gasps of amazement. I heard Tyler's mother whisper to someone at her table about how generous and loving Amanda's parents were. Amanda burst into tears and jumped up to hug both our parents, while Tyler stood and shook Dad's hand with genuine gratitude and respect. I sat frozen in my chair, my own wine glass untouched, as the reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. They were giving away the house that I had been paying for. The house where I had invested over $120,000 of my own money over 5 years. The house that legally, according to the paperwork in my filing cabinet at home, I partially owned. Amanda was now making a tearful speech about how much the house meant to her, how it represented all her childhood memories and dreams for the future. She talked about wanting to raise her own children in those same rooms where she had grown up, about the legacy of love and stability that our parents had created there. "This house represents everything beautiful about family," she said through her tears. "Mom and Dad sacrificed so much to keep it in our family, and now Tyler and I get to continue that tradition. We are so incredibly grateful for this amazing gift." Tyler added his own thanks, mentioning how impressed he was with our parents' sacrifice and generosity. He promised to take excellent care of the property and maintain the beautiful garden that Mom had spent decades perfecting. He talked about modernizing the kitchen and adding a master suite improvements that would easily cost $60,000 or $70,000. As I listened to this mutual admiration society, I found myself doing the math that had become second nature after 5 years of financial responsibility. The house was worth about $250,000 in the current market. I had paid in $120,000, plus thousands more in property maintenance and emergency repairs that I had covered whenever something broke. By any reasonable calculation, I owned nearly half of the property they were so generously giving away. But the worst part was not the financial betrayal. The worst part was listening to my father talk about sacrifice and generosity while completely erasing my role in saving their home. In his version of this story, he and Mom had somehow managed to pay off the mortgage through their own hard work and sacrifice. There was no mention of the son who had delayed buying his own home, who had driven cars until they fell apart, who had eaten ramen noodles for dinner more nights than he cared to remember. After the speeches ended and the celebration resumed, I excused myself and walked outside to the restaurant's patio area. I needed air and space to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text message from my girlfriend Sarah, asking how the dinner was going. I stared at the screen, unable to find words to explain that my family had just given away my investment to my sister, and then been praised for their generosity in doing so. When I returned to the table 20 minutes later, the conversation had moved on to honeymoon plans and wedding details. Amanda was describing their planned trip to Italy, a 3-week tour of Tuscany and the Italian Riviera that would cost more than I made in several months. Tyler was explaining how they would time the trip with the renovation schedule, so the house would be ready when they returned. That is when my father made the comment that truly revealed how little he understood about the financial reality of this gift. The best part is that we finally paid off that mortgage last year, so Amanda and Tyler are getting a completely debt-free home. We wanted to make sure we could give them something really special. I nearly choked on my wine. They had not paid off anything. I was still making payments. The mortgage had 4 more years remaining on it, and I was still responsible for every monthly installment. They were not giving Amanda a debt-free home. They were giving her a home that I would continue paying for while she lived in it. The legal documentation in my home office suddenly felt like a life preserver in an ocean of betrayal. When I had started making those payments 5 years ago, I never thought I would need to use that paperwork to protect myself from my own family. But now, sitting at this table and watching them celebrate giving away my investment, I realized that my father's insistence on having everything legally documented might be the only thing standing between me and complete financial ruin. Amanda was already talking about paint colors and furniture arrangements, planning her life in a house that I had saved from foreclosure. And somewhere in my growing anger and disbelief, I felt the first stirring of a resolution that would change everything. This betrayal would not stand, and the legal protections I had insisted upon 5 years ago might be the key to ensuring that justice was eventually served. The wedding took place the following Saturday at Tyler's Family Country Club, a sprawling estate 30 minutes outside Cleveland, with manicured golf courses and a ballroom that overlooked Lake Erie. I stood at the altar as Amanda's groomsman, wearing a rented tuxedo that cost more for one day than most people spend on work clothes in 6 months, smiling for photographs that would probably end up in the society pages of the local newspaper. Amanda looked radiant in a wedding dress that probably cost as much as a decent used car. The ceremony itself was flawless, with 200 guests, a string quartet, and flower arrangements that could have fed a family of 4 for a month. Tyler's family had spared no expense, and the celebration felt more like a corporate merger than a marriage between 2 people who had known each other for less than 18 months. During the reception, I found myself calculating the cost of everything I saw. The open bar with top-shelf liquor, the 7-course dinner prepared by a celebrity chef, the ice sculptures and elaborate centerpieces, the live band that played until midnight. My conservative estimate put the total cost at around $60,000, which was more money than I earned in an entire year after taxes and family obligations. As I watched Amanda dance with our father, both of them laughing and crying with joy, I tried to suppress the growing bitterness that had been eating away at me since the rehearsal dinner. This was supposed to be a celebration of love and new beginnings, but all I could think about was the financial sacrifice that had made it all possible. Without my monthly mortgage payments, our parents would have lost their home years ago, and there would be no generous wedding gift to celebrate. The following Tuesday, I received a casual text message from Mom asking if I wanted to join them at the real estate attorney's office on Thursday afternoon. "Amanda and Tyler are finalizing the house transfer," she wrote. "Would be nice if the whole family could be there for this special moment." I took time off work and drove to the attorney's office, a glass tower downtown, where Tyler's family apparently conducted all their legal business. The waiting room felt more like a luxury hotel lobby than a law office, with marble floors, leather furniture, and oil paintings that probably cost more than my annual rent. When we were called into the conference room, I found myself sitting across from a mahogany table that could have seated 20 people. Amanda and Tyler were dressed like they were heading to a business meeting, which I suppose they were. My parents wore their Sunday best and looked somewhat overwhelmed by the formal surroundings. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Blackwell, who probably charged $500 an hour, began reviewing the property transfer documents. She mentioned the outstanding mortgage balance and asked about the payment arrangements, which created an uncomfortable moment where everyone looked at each other uncertainly. "There seems to be some confusion in the financial records," she said, flipping through pages of documentation. "The mortgage is still active with 4 years remaining on the 30-year loan. Are the current owners planning to satisfy the remaining debt before transfer, or will the new owners be assuming the mortgage?" My father cleared his throat and gave a vague explanation about family arrangements and how Corbett helps out with some of the expenses sometimes. The way he phrased it made my 5 years of complete financial responsibility sound like occasional assistance with utility bills. Amanda signed the documents with a flourish, officially becoming the sole owner of a $250,000 property. Tyler signed as well, adding his name to the deed as her spouse. I watched the transfer happen, feeling increasingly detached from the entire process, as if I were observing someone else's life rather than living my own. That evening, Amanda called me with breathless excitement about renovation plans. She and Tyler had already met with contractors and designers, and they were planning extensive improvements that would modernize the entire house. A new kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, a master bedroom suite with a spa bathroom, updated electrical and plumbing throughout the property. The contractor estimates it will cost around $80,000, but Tyler thinks it will add at least $120,000 to the property value, she said. "We are going to have the most beautiful home in the neighborhood." What she did not mention was where Mom and Dad would live during this construction project. I found out the answer on Friday evening when they showed up at my apartment with 3 suitcases and a sheepish request to stay in my spare bedroom temporarily while the renovations were completed. My 1-bedroom apartment suddenly became housing for 3 adults. Mom and Dad took over the living room, converting my couch into their bedroom and filling my limited storage space with their belongings. My quiet evenings after work became family time, whether I wanted it or not, with constant conversation, television programs I did not enjoy, and meals that I was expected to provide since they were my guests. The financial strain intensified immediately. I was now buying groceries for 3 people instead of 1. My utility bills doubled, and I was constantly driving them to appointments, social events, and shopping trips since their old car had finally died, and they could not afford to replace it. On top of all this, I was still making the $2,000 monthly mortgage payment on a house where my sister and her new husband were planning $80,000 in improvements. My girlfriend Sarah had been understanding at first, but the situation quickly became a source of serious tension in our relationship. Our plans to move in together had been postponed indefinitely since my parents had taken over my living space. Date nights became impossible when every evening involved family dinner and discussions about my parents' medical appointments or Amanda's renovation updates. The breaking point came during what should have been a romantic dinner at Sarah's apartment. I had arrived late because I needed to drive my father to a doctor's appointment, and I was distracted throughout the meal because Mom kept texting me questions about grocery shopping and household management. When Sarah asked about our future together and whether I was ready to commit to building a life with her, I realized I could not give her an answer. "I feel like I am competing with your family for your attention and your resources," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "You work all day to support them. You come home to take care of them, and you spend your weekends doing things for them. Where do I fit into that picture?" I tried to explain that the situation was temporary, that once the renovations were complete, my parents would move back to their house and everything would return to normal. But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow. Nothing was going to return to normal, because normal had never actually existed. For 5 years, I had been living my life around my family's needs and financial crises, and I had trained them to expect that level of support indefinitely. Sarah broke up with me the following Tuesday, citing my inability to establish healthy boundaries with my family. She said she loved me, but could not build a future with someone who would always put his family's wants ahead of their relationship's needs. As she handed back the key to my apartment, she wished me luck and said she hoped I would eventually realize that enabling my family's irresponsible behavior was not the same thing as loving them. 2 weeks later, during a family dinner at my kitchen table that had become a nightly routine, Amanda casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She and Tyler had decided that after the renovations were complete, they might sell the house and buy something bigger in the suburbs where they could start a family. "We figure we can probably get $400,000 for it after all the improvements," she said, cutting into the chicken I had bought and cooked for everyone. "Tyler wants a place with more land, maybe something with a pool and a 3-car garage." When I objected, pointing out that I had made a significant financial investment in that property, Amanda laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "It's not like you actually own it or anything, Corbett. Mom and Dad gave it to us as a wedding gift. Besides, you have been living rent-free your whole adult life, so this kind of evens things out." The casual cruelty of that comment hit me like a physical blow. I had not been living rent-free. I had been paying their mortgage instead of my own. I had delayed my own home ownership for 5 years to keep them from losing theirs. And now, my sister was treating my financial sacrifice as if it had never happened while planning to profit from my investment. When I turned to my parents for support, expecting them to at least acknowledge my contribution, I was met with uncomfortable silence. Finally, Dad spoke up, but instead of defending me, he sided with Amanda. "Family helps family, Corbett," he said. "You helped us when we needed it, and now we are helping Amanda and Tyler get started in their marriage. That's what families do for each other." Mom nodded in agreement, adding that I was being selfish to try to control what Amanda did with her wedding gift. "You are a single man with no responsibilities," she said. "Amanda and Tyler are planning for their future and their children. Why can't you be happy for your sister instead of making this about money?" That night, lying on my air mattress in the corner of my own bedroom, while my parents slept in my living room, I realized that my family had never seen my payments as an investment or even a significant sacrifice. They had simply redefined my financial support as my obligation, something I owed them, rather than something I chose to give them. For the first time in 5 years, I began to seriously consider the legal documentation I had insisted upon when this arrangement started. The papers that established my ownership stake in the property were locked away in my filing cabinet, largely forgotten, but still legally valid. I had never intended to use them against my family, but my family had apparently never intended to treat me with basic respect and gratitude either. The betrayal was complete, and I was finally ready to consider fighting back. 2 months had passed since the wedding, and my parents were still living in my spare bedroom, with no clear timeline for when the renovations would be finished. What had been described as a quick modernization project had turned into a complete gut renovation that showed no signs of ending anytime soon. Amanda texted me daily updates about delays, cost overruns, and design changes, but never seemed to consider how these delays affected our parents' living situation or my own life. The daily invasion of my privacy had become unbearable. Mom had rearranged my kitchen cabinets to suit her preferences, complained that my television was too small for proper viewing, and started inviting her friends over for coffee without asking my permission. Dad had taken over my dining table as his workspace for the crossword puzzles and paperwork he completed every morning, and he expected me to drive him to his part-time job at Home Depot whenever his schedule conflicted with the bus timetable. My financial situation had deteriorated to the point where I was considering taking out a personal loan just to cover basic living expenses. In addition to the ongoing mortgage payments, I was now responsible for groceries, utilities, gasoline, and miscellaneous expenses for 3 adults instead of 1. My parents contributed nothing financially, treating their stay at my apartment like an extended vacation where all their needs would be automatically provided. The stress was affecting my work performance for the first time in my career. I arrived at the office exhausted from sleepless nights, on an air mattress in my own bedroom, distracted by constant family demands, and unable to focus on the complex programming projects that had once energized and challenged me. My manager had noticed the decline and suggested I consider taking some personal time to resolve whatever was affecting my ability to concentrate. But the breaking point came when I discovered that my parents had been conducting their own private investigation into my personal finances. I found bank statements in Dad's handwriting hidden among his crossword puzzles, along with what appeared to be calculations about my income, expenses, and savings. When I confronted him about this invasion of privacy, he became defensive and angry. "We have a right to know what our son can afford to help his family," he said. "If you have money that you are hiding from us while we struggle, that makes you selfish and ungrateful for everything we did raising you." The conversation escalated quickly when Mom joined in, accusing me of living beyond my means and hoarding resources while my family faced uncertainty. They had somehow discovered that I owned property they knew nothing about, and they demanded to know why I had been hiding assets, while claiming I could not afford to help them more than I already was. 3 years earlier, I had made the one purely selfish financial decision of my adult life. Using money I had originally saved for a down payment on my own home, I purchased a modest cabin on a lake 2 hours north of Cleveland. The property was nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom cottage with a small dock and enough land for privacy, but it represented my one escape from the constant demands and obligations of my family life. I had bought the cabin under a business entity to maintain some legal distance from my personal finances, and I had never mentioned it to anyone in my family. It was my sanctuary, the place where I went on weekends to decompress from work stress and family drama. The mortgage was manageable, the property taxes were reasonable, and the maintenance was minimal since I did most of the work myself. But somehow, my parents had discovered the property's existence when they saw mail addressed to me at the lake house address. The Postal Service had mistakenly delivered some of my banking correspondence to my apartment instead of the post office box I maintained for privacy, and Mom had opened it before I could intercept it. Their reaction to discovering my secret property was immediate and angry. They accused me of lying to them about my financial situation, hiding assets that could help the family, and being selfish while they struggled with housing insecurity. The fact that I had maintained one private space for myself while supporting them for 5 years was evidence of my fundamental lack of family loyalty. Within hours of this confrontation, Amanda was calling with her own accusations and demands. Mom had told her about the lake house, and she was furious that I had been keeping secrets while she and Tyler were paying for expensive renovations that could have been avoided if I had more resources available. "How can you sit there and watch us spend our own money improving the house when you have been hiding a vacation property this whole time?" she demanded. "If you had told us, You could afford to help more. We could have budgeted differently for this project." The twisted logic of their anger was breathtaking. I was being accused of selfishness for maintaining one private space, while paying their mortgage, supporting their living expenses, and housing them in my own apartment. My cabin, which represented the only financial decision I had made, purely for my own happiness in 5 years, was somehow evidence of my failure to properly support my family. But their discovery of the property was just the beginning of their demands. Over the next week, my parents developed an elaborate plan for how this cabin could solve all their current problems. They wanted to move to the lake house permanently, abandoning any pretense of returning to their renovated home once construction was complete. Their reasoning was compelling from their perspective. The lake area had a lower cost of living than Cleveland, which would reduce their financial needs. The peaceful setting would be better for Dad's health problems, which had been aggravated by the stress of the past 5 years. The property was large enough for them to have independence, while still receiving the financial support they had come to expect from me. Most importantly, from their point of view, moving to the lake would eliminate the awkwardness of their current living situation. They would have their own space again, their dignity would be preserved, and I would regain my privacy. It seemed like a perfect solution that would benefit everyone involved. What they failed to consider was that the lake house was never intended to be shared with anyone. It was my retreat, my investment in my own mental health and happiness, the one place where I could exist without family obligations and expectations. The idea of turning it into their permanent residence would eliminate the only refuge I had from the constant demands that had dominated my life for 5 years. When they presented their plan during what they called a family meeting at my kitchen table, I found myself in the unprecedented position of saying no to a family request. It was the first time in my adult life that I had refused to help them with anything, and the reaction was swift and brutal. Mom accused me of abandoning my family when they needed me most. Dad questioned my values and wondered aloud where they had failed in raising me. Amanda called me selfish and ungrateful, pointing out that our parents had sacrificed their entire lives for their children and deserved support in their golden years. But I held firm in my refusal, recognizing that giving them the lake house would eliminate the last vestige of independence I maintained. Once they moved there, I would be expected to continue supporting them financially, while they enjoyed a lifestyle that I had provided, but could not afford for myself. The pattern of sacrifice and resentment would continue indefinitely, with my wants and needs perpetually subordinated to their comfort and convenience. The argument continued for hours, with increasing hostility and manipulation from all sides. They threatened to cut off contact with me if I did not reconsider my position. They questioned my love for them and suggested that maybe they had been wrong to depend on someone who would abandon them when they needed help. Finally, Mom made a statement that felt like a direct threat, though it was phrased as concern for my welfare. "If you refuse to help your family, Corbett, something terrible might happen, and it will be your fault. We raised you better than this, and when you realize what you have done, it will be too late to fix it." The ominous tone of her words stayed with me long after they had gone to bed that night. It felt like more than disappointment or emotional manipulation. It felt like a warning about consequences that went beyond strained family relationships. But I was determined not to give in to threats or emotional blackmail, no matter how serious they sounded. 3 days later, I woke up to find my apartment empty and my parents gone. When I returned from a business trip to Chicago on Thursday evening, my apartment felt different the moment I opened the door. The silence was immediate and complete, lacking the constant background noise of television programs, conversations, and daily activities that had defined my living space for the past 2 months. I called out for Mom and Dad, but received no response. Their belongings were gone from the living room, leaving behind only indentations in my couch cushions and a faint scent of Dad's aftershave. I found no note of explanation, no forwarding information, nothing to indicate where they had gone or whether they intended to return. When I checked my phone for missed calls or text messages, I discovered that all my attempts to reach them were going straight to voicemail. For the first time in months, I had my privacy back. I could eat dinner in peace, watch whatever television program I wanted, and sleep in my own bedroom without listening to Dad snoring from the living room. But the relief was complicated by genuine concern about their well-being. Whatever our disagreements about money and boundaries, I loved my parents and worried about their safety when they disappeared without explanation. I called Amanda on Friday morning, hoping she might have information about their whereabouts, but she claimed she had not heard from them since our argument earlier in the week. Her tone was cold and accusatory, suggesting that their disappearance was somehow my fault for refusing to let them move to the lake house. "They were really hurt by your selfishness, Corbett," she said. "They probably just need some space to figure out their next steps, since their own son will not help them." When I pressed her for more details about possible places they might have gone, she said she was too busy with renovation decisions to play detective for my guilty conscience. Over the weekend, I tried to enjoy my restored independence while managing my growing anxiety about my parents' safety. I drove to the lake house on Saturday afternoon, hoping to find some peace in my familiar retreat, but even the tranquil setting could not completely eliminate my worry. The property felt different, knowing that my family considered it rightfully theirs, and I found myself questioning whether I had made the right choice in refusing their demand. By Sunday evening, I had convinced myself that maybe their disappearance was for the best. They had probably found temporary housing with other family members or friends, and perhaps some distance would help all of us gain perspective on our strained relationships. Maybe this crisis would force them to develop more realistic expectations about financial support and personal boundaries. My optimism was shattered on Tuesday evening when my phone rang with a call from an unknown local number. The voice on the other end identified himself as Officer Martinez with the Cleveland Police Department, and he was calling about an incident involving my parents. "Mr. Davidson, we found your parents unconscious in their vehicle this afternoon in the parking lot of a Walmart on the east side of the city," he said. "They have been transported to Metro Hospital and are currently in intensive care. We found your contact information listed as their emergency contact." The drive to the hospital felt surreal, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold, rather than living my own. Officer Martinez met me in the emergency waiting room and explained what they knew about the circumstances surrounding the discovery of my parents. A concerned shopper had noticed two elderly people slumped over in a parked car and called 911 when they could not rouse them by knocking on the windows. Paramedics had found empty prescription bottles on the front seat, along with a handwritten note that appeared to be a suicide letter. The preliminary medical assessment suggested drug overdose, probably from consuming the entire contents of multiple prescription medications simultaneously. They were alive, but in critical condition, and it was too early to determine whether they would recover fully or suffer permanent damage. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician in the intensive care unit, explained that they were dealing with a complex medical situation involving multiple medications and possible organ damage. Both patients were on life support, while their systems processed the drugs, and the next 24 to 48 hours would be crucial in determining their prognosis. "Were there any signs of depression or suicidal ideation in recent weeks?" she asked. "Any major life changes or stressors that might have contributed to this incident?" As I tried to explain the complex family dynamics and financial tensions that had been building over recent months, I heard familiar voices in the waiting room. Amanda had arrived with Tyler and several other family members, and she was making a scene loud enough to be heard throughout the intensive care unit. "This is all Corbett's fault," she was telling anyone who would listen. "Our parents were desperate because their own son abandoned them when they needed help. He forced them into homelessness and then refused to take responsibility for his actions." When she saw me talking with the doctor and police officer, Amanda stormed over and began a public confrontation that drew stares from other families dealing with their own medical emergencies. She accused me of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and driving our parents to desperation through my selfishness and cruelty. Tyler tried to calm her down, but she was beyond rational conversation. In her version of events, my parents had been living in their car for days because I had kicked them out of my apartment for asking reasonable questions about my finances. She claimed they had been too proud to ask for help and too ashamed to admit that their son had abandoned them in their hour of need. Other relatives began arriving throughout the evening, and most of them had clearly heard Amanda's version of events before coming to the hospital. Uncle Frank, Mom's brother, looked at me with disgust and asked how I could live with myself after driving my parents to attempted suicide. Aunt Patricia wondered aloud whether there might be legal consequences for abandoning elderly parents who were clearly unable to care for themselves. The social worker assigned to the case, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, pulled me aside for a private conversation about the family dynamics that had led to this crisis. She explained that the hospital was required to investigate any suspected cases of elder abuse or neglect, and she needed to understand the financial and living arrangements that had preceded this incident. As I tried to explain the complex history of financial support property arrangements and recent disagreements, I realized how suspicious my story must have sounded to an outsider. A son who had been supporting his parents secretly for years but refused to let them move to his vacation property sounded like someone who was controlling their access to resources for his own benefit. Officer Martinez returned with additional questions about the suicide note, which contained specific details that did not match the timeline I had provided. The note mentioned their eviction from my apartment and their fear of homelessness, but I had never evicted them. They had left voluntarily after our argument about the lake house, and I had not asked them to leave. The note also references financial abuse and manipulation. He said, reading from his report, "It mentions years of promises that were not kept and fear that their son was stealing their money. Do these accusations match anything you know about their mental state recently?" I found myself in the surreal position of defending my character and actions to police officers, while my parents lay unconscious in intensive care beds 20 feet away. The very people I had been supporting and sacrificing for had apparently left behind documentation blaming me for the desperation that led to their suicide attempt. But as Officer Martinez showed me photocopies of the note for verification purposes, I noticed something odd about the handwriting and language patterns. Some of the phrases did not sound like anything my parents would say, and certain details about our living arrangements were inaccurate in ways that suggested whoever wrote the note was not entirely familiar with the actual facts of our situation. When I mentioned these concerns to Officer Martinez, he made notes in his report and suggested that they would need to conduct a more thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding the incident. Security footage from the Walmart parking lot might provide additional information about how long my parents had been there and whether anyone else had been present. The next morning brought the first encouraging medical news since the crisis began. Both parents were showing signs of neurological improvement, and Dr. Chen was cautiously optimistic about their chances for recovery. But she warned that it would be several days before they were conscious enough to provide their own account of what had happened and why. Meanwhile, the investigation was taking an increasingly troubling direction. Officer Martinez called to inform me that security footage from the Walmart showed my parents had not been alone in the parking lot. Another vehicle had been present when they were discovered, and 2 people had left the scene before emergency services arrived. The license plate was visible in some of the footage, and they were working to identify the other parties involved. When I asked if the handwriting analysis of the suicide note had revealed anything significant, he said the department's document examiner would need more time to complete a thorough comparison. But preliminary review suggested the note had been composed on a computer and printed rather than handwritten, despite appearing to be in my father's handwriting at first glance. The possibility that this incident was not a simple suicide attempt began to change everything about my understanding of the past week. If someone else had been involved in creating the circumstances that led to my parents' overdose, then this was not a family tragedy resulting from financial stress, but something far more calculated and dangerous. And the most likely candidates for that level of manipulation were the family members who had been present when my parents disappeared and who stood to benefit most from their incapacitation. As I sat in the hospital waiting room watching Amanda play the role of grieving daughter for the benefit of visiting relatives and medical staff, I began to suspect that this crisis was not the result of my boundary setting after all. It was the result of a plan that had been set in motion when I refused to give them what they wanted, and my parents were not the architects of this scheme, but its victims. The investigation took a dramatic turn on Wednesday morning when Officer Martinez called with results from the security footage analysis. The license plate captured in the Walmart parking lot belonged to Tyler's BMW, and enhanced video clearly showed both Amanda and Tyler in the vicinity of my parents' car approximately 30 minutes before they were discovered unconscious. "We need to bring your sister and brother-in-law in for questioning," Officer Martinez explained. Their presence at the scene, combined with the suspicious circumstances surrounding the note, suggests this incident may not have been a suicide attempt. I immediately called my lawyer, David Brennan, who had helped me structure the original mortgage arrangement 5 years earlier. When I explained the situation and shared the legal documentation proving my ownership stake in the family home, David's reaction was swift and decisive. "You need to file a police report about the property transfer immediately," he said. "If Amanda knew about your legal interest in the house when she accepted the deed that constitutes fraud, and if she was involved in staging your parents' overdose to manipulate the situation, we are looking at much more serious criminal charges." The hospital toxicology reports provided even more disturbing evidence about what had actually happened to my parents. Dr. Chen explained that the drug levels in their blood were precisely calibrated to cause unconsciousness and medical distress without being immediately fatal. Someone with medical knowledge or access to detailed drug information had calculated dosages that would create a dramatic emergency without actually killing them. "This was not a suicide attempt," she said bluntly. "This was a carefully planned incident designed to cause maximum alarm while ensuring survival. Whoever did this knew exactly how much medication would create the desired effect without crossing the line into lethal territory." When I shared this information with Officer Martinez, the investigation officially became a criminal case involving suspected assault, elder abuse, and fraud. A warrant was issued to search Amanda's apartment and Tyler's vehicle, and both were brought in for formal questioning about their whereabouts during the time period when my parents disappeared. The evidence discovered during these searches was devastating to Amanda's credibility. The supposed suicide note had been composed and printed on her laptop computer with digital timestamps, proving it was created after my parents had already been hospitalized. Text messages between Amanda and Tyler discussed insurance solutions and permanent arrangements for dealing with the Corbett problem. Bank records revealed that Amanda had been accessing my parents' checking account without authorization for several weeks, draining their modest savings and creating financial desperation that did not actually exist. She had also forged their signatures on several documents, including a power of attorney form that would have given her control over their affairs if they had become incapacitated. The motive became clear when investigators examined Tyler's financial situation more closely. His investment banking position was less secure than he had pretended, and he had accumulated substantial gambling debts that his family refused to cover. Amanda's previous marriages had both ended under suspicious financial circumstances, and she was facing potential bankruptcy if she could not access new sources of income quickly. Their plan had been elegant in its simplicity: stage my parents' suicide attempt and blame it on my abandonment and financial abuse. Gain legal guardianship of incapacitated parents, which would give them access to any ongoing financial support I provided. Force me to sell the lake house to cover medical expenses and family obligations. Control the narrative about family dynamics to ensure I was seen as the villain, while they were seen as the responsible caregivers. The discovery of witness testimony from the apartment complex, where my parents had been staying, provided additional evidence of their manipulation. Several neighbors reported seeing Amanda and Tyler visiting my parents multiple times during the week they had supposedly disappeared. One witness had overheard Amanda arguing with Mom about taking medication, and another had seen Tyler carrying what appeared to be prescription bottles to their car. Most importantly, the neighbors confirmed that my parents had not been living in their car at all. They had been staying in a friend's guest room and seemed to be in good health and spirits until the day before the incident. The story about homelessness and desperation had been completely fabricated to support the suicide narrative. When my parents finally regained consciousness on Thursday evening, their confused questions confirmed what the investigation had already revealed. They had no memory of taking any medication voluntarily, and their last clear recollection was Amanda bringing them coffee and pastries during a visit to discuss important family business. Dad was particularly bewildered by the suicide note attributed to him. "I never wrote anything like that, Corbett," he said, his voice still weak from the medical ordeal. "The last thing I remember is Amanda saying she had found a way to solve all our problems, and then everything went black." Mom's memories were similar, focusing on Amanda's sudden interest in helping them find a permanent housing solution that would restore their independence. "She seemed so caring and concerned about our welfare," Mom whispered. "She brought us those pastries as a peace offering after our argument, and she said she had been wrong to blame you for setting boundaries." The emotional impact of learning they had been drugged by their own daughter was devastating for both parents, but it also clarified the true dynamics of our family situation. For the first time in years, they began to understand the extent of my financial sacrifice and the unreasonable nature of their expectations about ongoing support. During a tearful conversation in Dad's hospital room, both parents apologized for taking my contributions for granted and failing to recognize the unfair burden they had placed on my life. Dad was particularly emotional about the legal documentation he had signed 5 years earlier, realizing that his insistence on formal agreements had been the only thing protecting me from complete financial exploitation. "I thought I was doing the right thing by making sure your investment was protected," he said. "I never imagined we would need those papers to prove that you deserved respect and gratitude instead of demands and manipulation." My lawyer began preparing both criminal complaints and civil litigation to recover my losses and protect my parents from future exploitation. The criminal charges against Amanda and Tyler included elder abuse, assault fraud conspiracy, and attempted insurance fraud. The civil lawsuit sought recovery of my investment in the family home, plus damages for emotional distress and financial harm. The legal strategy was comprehensive and aggressive, designed to ensure that Amanda and Tyler faced serious consequences for their actions, while providing maximum protection for my parents and myself. David had also discovered precedents for adult children who had been financially exploited by family members, and he was confident that we could establish a strong case for restitution and punitive damages. But the most shocking revelation came during Amanda's interrogation, when investigators discovered this was not her first attempt at elder exploitation. Her first marriage had ended when her elderly husband died, under suspicious circumstances, leaving her his entire estate. The life insurance company had investigated, but could not prove wrongdoing at the time. With the new evidence from my parents' case, authorities decided to reopen the investigation into her first husband's death. The pattern of behavior suggested that Amanda was essentially a serial predator who targeted vulnerable elderly people for financial gain, using family relationships and emotional manipulation to access their resources. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who was leading the expanded investigation, explained that Amanda's methods were more sophisticated than typical elder abuse cases. She identifies targets who have financial assets but emotional vulnerabilities, then positions herself as the caring family member while systematically isolating them from other support systems. The realization that my sister was potentially a serial killer who had been planning to exploit and possibly harm our own parents was almost too horrific to process. But it also explained the calculated nature of her recent behavior, the precise timing of her demands, and the professional execution of the staged suicide attempt. As the criminal case developed, I found myself transitioning from victim to witness in a complex prosecution that would determine not only justice for my family, but potentially prevent Amanda from harming other vulnerable people in the future. The legal documentation that Dad had insisted upon 5 years earlier was not just protecting my financial investment. It was providing the evidence needed to stop a dangerous predator who happened to share my DNA. The weight of everything that had happened was overwhelming, but I also felt a growing sense of relief that the truth was finally emerging. After years of feeling guilty about setting boundaries and questioning my own judgment about family obligations, I was learning that my instincts about manipulation and exploitation had been completely accurate. The legal resolution came swifter than anyone expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of additional charges related to her first husband's death, Amanda accepted a plea agreement that would send her to prison for 8 years on charges of elder abuse fraud and conspiracy. Tyler received a 5-year sentence for his role in the scheme, and his investment banking license was permanently revoked. As part of the plea agreement, Amanda was required to pay full restitution covering my investment in the family home, my parents' medical expenses, and damages for emotional distress. The court ordered the immediate transfer of the house deed back to my name, recognizing my legal ownership stake and the fraudulent nature of the original gift transaction. Tyler's family, horrified by the scandal and determined to distance themselves from the criminal activity, covered the restitution payments immediately to avoid prolonged legal proceedings. The money was sufficient to compensate me fully for my 5 years of mortgage payments plus interest, while also establishing a trust fund to cover my parents' ongoing medical care and living expenses. The house itself was sold within 6 weeks of Amanda's sentencing, generating enough proceeds to provide financial security for my parents, without requiring ongoing support from me. They used their portion of the sale to purchase a comfortable apartment in a senior living community where they could maintain independence while having access to medical care and social activities. For the first time in 5 years, I was able to make financial decisions based on my own needs and goals, rather than family obligations. The restitution payments allowed me to purchase a proper home for myself, a modest 3-bedroom house near the lake, where I could build the life I had been postponing for years. My relationship with Sarah was restored, gradually built on a much healthier foundation of mutual respect and clear boundaries. She had been following the criminal case through news reports, and she understood that my previous inability to prioritize our relationship had been the result of manipulation rather than misplaced values. We were engaged 6 months after Amanda's sentencing, planning a wedding that would reflect our own values and priorities, rather than family expectations or financial pressure. The ceremony would be small and intimate, focused on celebrating our commitment, rather than impressing other people with expensive displays. My parents' transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire ordeal. Dad found part-time work at a local community center, teaching basic construction skills to young people preparing for trade careers. The work gave him purpose and pride without the financial pressure he had carried for decades as the family provider. Mom discovered a talent for volunteer work, particularly with elderly residents who had been isolated from their families. Her experience with Amanda's manipulation gave her unique insight into the warning signs of elder abuse, and she became an advocate for protective services and family counseling programs. Both parents attended therapy to process the trauma of being victimized by their own daughter, but they also used the experience to develop healthier perspectives on family relationships and financial independence. They learned to appreciate my past contributions without expecting ongoing sacrifice, and they began to take pride in managing their own affairs rather than relying on their children for support. The weekly family dinners we established became a source of genuine connection rather than obligation. We met at a restaurant where everyone paid their own bill, focusing our time together on conversation and shared experiences rather than financial discussions or family drama. These gatherings felt natural and enjoyable for the first time in years. Holiday celebrations were redesigned around time and attention rather than expensive gifts or elaborate hosting arrangements. We exchanged modest presents that reflected thoughtfulness rather than financial value, and we took turns hosting simple gatherings that emphasized spending time together over impressive displays of generosity. The criminal case also had broader social impact beyond our family situation. My experience became a precedent in Ohio courts for adult children who had been financially exploited by family members, establishing legal protections and recovery options that had not previously existed. I began speaking at support groups for people dealing with toxic family financial dynamics, sharing my story, and encouraging others to recognize the difference between helping family members and enabling their irresponsible behavior. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of people sharing similar experiences of being manipulated and exploited by relatives who used emotional leverage to access their resources. The lake house remained my personal retreat, but it also became a place where Sarah and I could host friends and family members who appreciated the gift of our time and hospitality. The property represented freedom and independence, rather than guilt and obligation, and I finally understood why I had been so determined to protect it from family demands. Amanda's appeals were unsuccessful, and she served her full sentence without the possibility of early parole. The investigation into her first husband's death resulted in additional charges extending her time in prison and ensuring that she would not be able to target other vulnerable people for years to come. Tyler's banking career was permanently destroyed, and his family's social standing never recovered from the scandal. He served his sentence quietly and moved to another state after his release, avoiding contact with anyone connected to the case. The renovation work on the family home was completed by the new owners, who transformed it into the beautiful property that Amanda had envisioned but could never enjoy. Driving past the house occasionally, I felt no sadness or regret about its sale, only relief that it no longer represented years of unacknowledged sacrifice and financial strain. The trust fund established for my parents' care was managed by an independent financial advisor, ensuring they had security and dignity without creating dependence on any family member. The arrangement gave them peace of mind about their future while protecting them from potential exploitation by anyone who might try to manipulate their finances. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the most important lesson was learning to distinguish between love and enablement in family relationships. True love sometimes requires setting boundaries and refusing to participate in unhealthy dynamics, even when those boundaries cause temporary conflict or disappointment. The legal documentation that my father had insisted upon 5 years earlier became the foundation for justice and recovery, proving that protecting yourself financially is not selfish, but necessary when dealing with people who might exploit your generosity. Trust and verification can coexist in healthy relationships, and reasonable people appreciate reasonable protections. My career flourished once the stress and distraction of family financial drama was eliminated. I received a promotion to Senior Development Manager, with opportunities for advancement that I could finally consider without worrying about family obligations or geographical limitations. Sarah and I began planning for our own family, knowing that our children would grow up in an environment where love was expressed through respect and healthy boundaries, rather than financial sacrifice and emotional manipulation. We wanted to model relationships based on mutual support, rather than one-sided obligation. The community of people I met through support groups and advocacy work became an extended chosen family that complemented my biological relationships. These friendships were built on shared experiences and mutual understanding, rather than blood connections or historical obligations. Most importantly, I learned that protecting your own financial security and emotional well-being is not selfish, but essential for being able to help others from a position of strength rather than desperation. The airplane safety instruction to secure your own oxygen mask before helping others applies to family finances, as well as emergency situations. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family members took your generosity for granted, or where setting healthy boundaries was seen as selfish rather than necessary? How did you handle the balance between helping loved ones and protecting your own future? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you think differently about family financial dynamics, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming difficult family situations and building healthier relationships. Share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that love and boundaries can coexist in family relationships. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it encourages you to value your own contributions and set appropriate expectations in your own family relationships. Remember that taking care of yourself is not selfish, but necessary for being able to take care of others in sustainable and healthy ways.